Jeffrey Kipnis is a professor of architecture at Ohio State University. He has been in and out of SCIARC many times for over 30 years as an instructor, advisor, lecturer, and critic. He is currently a visiting professor at SCIARC. What's interesting is I didn't know he was going to be teaching the director's studio along with Erica and Moss. So it'll be interesting to see the dialogues they have throughout the semester, and at some point this semester it'll be interesting to see how their interviews have a dialogue with each other. It's too difficult for me, at least, to introduce Jeff and attempt to list all that he has done in a short introduction. I just wouldn't be doing Jeff any justice. Instead, I'm going to share a quick story. I didn't know who Jeff was before I came to SCIARC, but very quickly I learned that when Jeff was in the vicinity, that students were on their toes and very cautious about what they were presenting, because they knew that they would be held accountable for what they say. What's interesting is that the students were interested in making sure that Jeff was interested in their work. In a way, Jeff's questioning was an acknowledgement to them that there was a project to be questioned. Jeff is extremely generous with his time and knowledge. Jeff probably won't remember this, but I remember in my first semester at SCIARC, I went up to him after he finished advising the undergraduate thesis students and embarrassingly asked, "I'm interested in blurring. What books would you recommend I read in order to blur?" Jeff was really sick with the flu at the time, but still entertained the conversation, and gave me his email and said he has a couple of books in mind. I lost his email, which was a good thing, so I didn't embarrass myself twice. Jeff critiques many architects and projects, but today I'm really interested in Jeff's position on architecture. It's really an attempt to create a platform to continue the conversations he's had in the past. If one of Corb's hits was towards a new architecture, then I think one of Kipnis's hits is towards a new architecturality. What it means or doesn't mean doesn't matter. It's just my reaction to listening to Jeff. I didn't prepare excessively for today intentionally, so that the conversation is steered more by Jeff than me, even though it's an interview. So we'll see how that goes. I hope it works out.
Great.
Thank you. So I'd like to start off by talking about something that actually came up a lot for the thesis reviews this year, which is personal and public as an approach to architecture. Do projects always have to be legible to the public, or can they be self-indulgent?
First, two things. Self-indulgent and personal aren't quite the same. In fact, it's difficult for me to imagine what it really does mean to be self-indulgent. So unlike Wes, and you're referring to an interesting conversation that two of us had in response to a project, I don't believe that architecture, even architecture that tries to be legible to the public, can be anything but personal. For two reasons. A person is constructed in a public realm and expresses that construction. You speak the language you speak, you wear the clothes that you speak, you have the accent that you speak. People know I'm from the South. They pretty much guess what schools I went to, what books I've read, what TV shows I watch. So everything about my personality, everything. In fact, even when I say the word I use exactly the same word as everyone else to express my personal opinion. And so those things that we think of as the most personal are actually quite public, and the other way around. And so we want that. We want a dialogue between the manifestation of the public in the personal and an acknowledgement that there's a difference between the two. And I think architecture does a very good job at that, but I think every form of work, whether it's physics or art, every science or not, has this same quality. It became formalized in linguistics in the separation between two things called parole and lang in semiotics, which is how one person speaks versus how the language itself is structured.
You talked a lot about the buildings or architecture is a game of effects and what effects they play. Is it then necessary then for the audience to know what effect is being played, or that they are getting an effect from the architecture?
It's more important that they are. In fact, I would kind of say it doesn't work if the audience knows what the effect is. sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but it's more like magic. It's not like mystery. It's not like calling up the gods and having them do something. It's like more like a magic trick. If you know how the magic trick works, it still kind of works, but it takes some of the edge off of it. So when a composer writes a soundtrack for a film, he's using tricks that he knows about how music affects most audiences, not all audiences, to condition how you respond to the film. And if you're paying very close attention to it, it doesn't work. If you're not paying attention to it at all, it's more likely to work.
You talked before about The Shining and that The Shining works when all the characters are in the right place, and once they're misplaced, that's when the plot thickens.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think you're in the right place within architecture?
You mean at SciArc or just as?
I think in general.
Well, I mean, for example, I was thinking about what you said earlier. People oftentimes ask me what books to read, and I'm in architecture, and I probably say yes. I will say these books, but the real answer I have in my head is you should be thinking about what projects to study, and then, of course, every architect should read, and of course you should, but you're going to learn more from studying other projects and then reading. Your painters are going to learn first by looking at other paintings, and then, of course, reading. In other words, having a conversation with other people occurs oftentimes through readings, but you really are going to have a conversation in the direct medium that you work in. And so I do believe I'm in the right. But somebody said, how important is the digital to your work? And I answered, I'm a writer, so word processing is incredibly important.
Well, actually, that leads to a question that I didn't know how to put into the interview. If we only had tabula rasas and context was no longer a backdrop for architects, what effect do you think that would have? Or do you think that's a necessary thing for us to maybe consider to sometimes?
Okay, see, now that's an interesting question. That question made sense 30 years ago, in which there were two things, tabula rasas, or let's say 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there was the proposition of the tabula rasa by Core and by the modernists, against which there was the existing condition, not even the context. So there was the tabula rasa and the existing condition. Slowly, the existing condition became codified into the existing condition and a more subtle understanding of it called the context. Hang on, let me finish. Now, we know something, then it became an argument that there was no such thing as a tabula rasa. So these arguments evolved. Today, we do believe there's such a thing as a tabula rasa. There are tabula rasas being constructed in China on purpose. We also know that we have probably 8 or 9 ways to look at a local condition that existed. Context, precincts, nearby zone, external. We have much more sophisticated apparatus to understand an existing condition than just the context from the work of other architects. So Frank Gehry, for example, has transformed the idea of what a context is. Rem Koolhaas has transformed the idea of what a context is. So this idea that there's such a thing as a tabula rasa and a context and an existing condition, 3 issues, because of work that has been done, not because of writing that was written. Work got done. We learned much more sophisticated techniques. It could be a nice little article, 15 ways to think about existing conditions in tabula rasa. That article can only get written because of work that has been done by architects. So that's what I think.
And Peter Eisenman's argument of project versus practice, do you believe that there is a segregation within the field? And can either project or practice be exercised without reference or dependence on context?
Yes, I absolutely believe it. First of all, lots of kinds of practices. Again, the days in which simple divisions, like you're talking about, existed were true. There are certain problems today in which simple dialectic divisions are true. It's just, energy efficient, energy not efficient. Works right now. 15 years from now, it's not going to work because we'll become sophisticated. But the idea of practice versus project started off as a pretty interesting argument. We now know 4 or 5 kinds of practices. There's service practices, there are disciplinary based, there's academic practices, all the kinds of practices. One thing is clear, there are certain practices in which the goal is the building. And the way you measure the success of a building, if that's the goal, is really its first 25 years of life. How well it performs for the client in those 25 years, a little bit like a dentist. There are other kinds of practices in which the goal of the project is not just a building. Sometimes it doesn't even matter too much if the work gets built, but also the dissemination of ideas, like research, like theoretical physics. And so the primary venue for that work is publication. And that's a legitimate practice. And so that would be what we used to call a project-based work. But since material issues are important to that work now, most of those works at least try to get built, get thought about being built. You know, so it's much more, it's not more complicated, it's more sophisticated. So, but I do think it makes a big difference to distinguish between a theoretical physicist and an applied physicist. And I think it makes a big difference to think of between, you know, a speculative architect and an applied architect. Like, I wouldn't want to go to a theoretical dentist. I want to go to an applied dentist. But I'm glad there are theoretical dentists, so that in my lifetime, when I first went to a dentist, it hurt. And there were gigantic things. I mean, you're not kidding me. It was a scary, painful, horrible experience. Now it's fantastic. Now the worst thing that can happen to you is they put the wrong flavored foam in your mouth.
You've previously given a lot of advice on how to become a successful architect.
Yeah.
What tips?
That'd be very good.
But what tips do you have to becoming a good architect, and not necessarily?
Understand that to be an architect means to be able to gain pleasures from lots of different. Like, a good architect might be able to gain a great deal of satisfaction from satisfying a client. A good architect might be able to gain a great deal of personal satisfaction and benefit the discipline a lot by learning how to build quickly for a certain price and well. Might do well by actually thinking about new ways to organize plans, new forms, new ways to approach the context. So I no longer think of there's such a thing as a single value structure. It's a spectrum of values, and you shouldn't engage in oppositional practice. Because I'm interested in one, your work is bad. It's just silly. It's like, because I like classical music doesn't make hip hop bad. That doesn't make any sense. To recognize that they both have attributes that are worthwhile. Like, an expert at classical music doesn't mean he could write hip hop better, or probably means couldn't write it at all, and vice versa. So I don't think the questions, I like to think now in terms of spectra instead of dialectics.
What do you think is stronger, to be for tendencies or affinities?
Tendencies. I'm for tendencies.
And in the article, you mentioned a word that right now I think is my favorite word in the architecture discourse, which is interarchitecturality, and a play on Julia's term intertextuality. How important is it now to be interarchitectural, and like why?
I think it's very important. It's very hard for architecture because it has an ethos of independence. You know, it has a solipsistic ethos. The heroic architect, the singular product. So to understand the exchanges between one project and another, and the building between how much they depend on each other, it's very difficult to convince an architect to be with. In fact, that's why I'm doing a conversation this year with the faculty about how the other faculty have affected them, and how the students have affected them. And I expect it to be quite difficult, these conversations. So when I ask Andrew how much Elena has affected his work, he'll be happy to say she definitely shows up in my teaching. But much influenced. Like let's say I say that, Eric Owen Moss, that his work is very much influenced by Tom Maine. He gets very uncomfortable, vice versa, and doesn't like it when I show it. And I think that's too bad. So step one is to get the ethos to change, and step two is to realize how fantastic that is, and how important that is to cultivate as a kind of knowledge, because it also means we can speak to each other better and also to a world better.
You've had a huge influence on a lot of faculties yourself, I mean, and a lot of schools. You're
I'm not so sure that's good, but yeah.
Whether it's good or bad, there has been an
Sure.
influence. I think it's good personally. What influence has it been on you to be in contact with so many various faculties, like it has, like AA, SCI-Arc?
Well, I mean, it's, I don't know if you ever saw this movie Ratatouille, but I mean, imagine your desire is to think a lot about food, and you spend your life going from one great chef to another. I mean, and the problem is, let's say you're at one great school, you're going to eat a great school of food a lot, but you're not going to realize how many other ones there are. And so the generosity of my school to let me go to these other schools, and the generosity of other schools to have me there, gives me a completely unique perspective about just how much originality there is, just how much exchange there is, but also independence there is, how quickly things change over time. 10 years ago, truly seemed like every school was converging on the same idea because of digital technology, and that they all had turned into the same thing, and every school was complaining that there was no point that there was no difference between one school and another. And I was on faculty meetings at every school. We're no different than Harvard, Harvard's no different. Yeah. Now, every school is totally different. I mean, it really happened in 10 years. And so, no one gets to see that as fast as I get to see it, because I get to move around very quickly. It's also good for my school because they really like me, but they don't really like me around too much. It's like having a gorilla around too much.
I did an interview with Eric, and this is the second interview. It's obviously, I'm a student, undergraduate student here at SCI-Arc, and the interview is basically for other students to watch and hopefully benefit. I think to say what advice do you have for students might be beating up a dead horse, but what advice do you have?
No, I have. First of all, let me say three things. A teacher should always be able to say immediately what they have advice for students. The job of a teacher is simple. The job of a teacher is to take something that seems really hard, like playing the piano, doing physics, doing architecture, breaking it down into a series of simple exercises that you repeat by rote, and then you learn how to do. And in that way, I can teach you how to take a work of genius and repeat it. You won't do better at it than mediocre. Well, a teacher can't turn you into a genius, but a teacher can give you sufficient command over how to repeat the genius that you can become one later on. So it's really simple. One is you have to learn the history of the discipline. You have to learn the projects. That is like a chess master has to know a lot of chess games. So there's two articles I give out to every student. One is called Expertise. It's from Scientific American, and basically it says in every discipline you find exactly the same thing. The experts know a lot of examples. That can be a trap because the examples can also trap you, so there's a risk. But you need to know a lot of examples because it's from those examples that you can be original. Without knowing those examples, no chance. The next thing is, how do you produce these effects that we were talking about? And right now they're more like magic tricks than they are, they're like music or like a magician. They're not like scientific tricks. So you have to study the way architects know what happens when you go up a staircase or down a staircase. And I'll tell you something that I think you'd be surprised at. For 3,000 years going down a staircase did one thing. It pretty much scared the shit out of you. Because it's where dead people were. So every time somebody goes downstairs to do the laundry in into the basement, they get scared, whether they're 5 years old, 20 years old. If you go upstairs to do the laundry, it's not as scary. Now we know 10 things going down a staircase can do because of changes in work. And you learn these from projects. So these are magic tricks. These are not mystical tricks. And you have to, there's not a whole lot of them, but you have to know those, learn how to use those, learn when to use those, and then experiment with changes in those. Oftentimes, more often than not, those experiments aren't going to work. That's just what happens with an experiment. So learn projects, learn what they do, why they do it, how you might use those in your own thinking. That's expertise. Learn to think about the effects you want to produce and why you want to produce them. Like, for example, symmetry is an effect. So you don't avoid symmetry because somebody told you it was bad. You avoid it because the effect works and you don't like that effect. So not symmetry is not an effect.
Talking about projects, let's talk about the ground that accommodates the project. How important is it to consider the ground, and has the discipline moved past the ground being an issue?
Super interesting question. I would say certainly until 1990, 1995, the ground was the most important thing in architectural history from its beginning till 1990. I would say ground and air was the most in the sky was the most important thing from the beginning of architectural history till the beginning of the 20th century. But starting in the 20th century, and certainly by 1960, 1970, when skyscrapers became boring, and when we went to the moon, and when we started flying in jets, people really didn't care about the sky anymore. It's true. And so you don't see much discourse of the sky. So something that lasted 3,000 years has kind of faded away. Maybe it'll come back. There's real good reason to think now that the ground may be going away. I don't know. But there's lots of reasons to think that after all these years, it's certainly not a given like it used to be. It's under contest now in a really interesting way.
Let's wrap up with the last question because you need to leave.
Okay.
What's next? I know that you're not very chronological, and I don't mean what's next in the sense of architecture, what's next in the field, but what's next in what I've analyzed in your work. I feel like you've had temporary biases, so you move from one bias
I was sort of,
to another.
first of all, I get bored really easy. I'm a short attention span. I have ADHD, I'm proud of it.
So right now, what's your bias right now? And
what fascinates me right now is we're coming out of the digital period and moving into the data period. Basically because of storage. So that really means instead of writing elegant algorithms, like rendering algorithms, we write brute force algorithms. But what that really means in a bigger way is like for example, we could figure out who said the word awesome, which is now going through its third period of popularity. People don't know this. There was 2 times before in the United States where the using of the word like cool or that sort of stuff. Twice before in the history of the United States, awesome went through a big fad. This time, however, it's gone through a global fad. It's like a global epidemic because of media. But using stuff like the NSA files that Snowden revealed, we could actually figure out where it came from. Now that person, I think, produced a kind of property. So I think what I'm starting to think is data is going to affect architecture because it's going to allow new forms of property to be produced. And actually architecture is closely related to theories of property. Real property, private personal property, intellectual property, in ways that are too difficult to the theoretical entanglement between creative activity in general, but architecture in particular, to new forms of property, is really a profound question. And for me, that's the thing I'm sort of interested in right now. And I think what you have to do first is you write stories about it. Then you make fictional worlds about it. And then we'll see what happens.
I would want to give Jeff the last word, but I'm going to put in the last word. And not all schools are lucky enough to have Jeff around. At SIARC, we're incredibly lucky if you're a school or a student, because we're going to try and get this out on social media as much as we can, we're going to try and popularize these two interviews. I would really recommend that you check out Jeffrey Kipnis. I mean, Google him, his articles, but mostly if you're not someone that wants to read, watch his Ohio State classes. They're all on YouTube. He gets pretty nervous in lectures, but for no apparent reason. I'm pretty nervous for having you and talking to you. So thank you very much for your time.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.